Welcome to my talk on the necessity of metaphors in life and the danger of erasing them in translation. I appreciate you joining me today as I merge my experience with the brain and the Bible. I want to present some selective data to try to convince you to cultivate an awareness of metaphors and their potential. Potential of metaphors' frequent occurrence, potential for metaphors to be overlooked and even erased at a high cost to us, and the capacity we have as humans to calculate the meaning of metaphors. Let's get on the same page to look at a formal definition of metaphor. The Oxford Dictionary describes it as figurative language in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. Okay, this makes sense. For example, the metaphor in James 1 of somebody being a wave tossed by the wind. It's not literally describing somebody as a wave, but describing somebody as a wave and drawing out some similarities between person and wave. My own definition is a little bit simpler, comparing something not easy to perceive with five senses, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, to something that is easier to perceive. So using something concrete to point to a meaning that's a little bit more abstract. I keep this definition simple, partly because I use this definition to discuss with kids as well as erudite crowds like you. Also, it allows me to include many kinds of language. Now, as a neurocognitive linguist, I feel that surface form is not as important. So what the presence of the word like or is doesn't matter to me as long as there's a comparison that somebody is calculating. So to me, a metaphor can include similes, metonymy, and even idioms, phrases where words are put together and the person who knows that language knows the meaning. As a cognitive linguist, I also conceive of concepts as being activated within a neural network. Nouns are not just represented by a single cell in the brain. They're activated with related actions and props and agents. For example, thinking about a servant activates a whole network in the brain involving chains, a lord and master, maybe a visual of scars from a whip, but most importantly, submitting the will to somebody else. A neural activation depends on previous experiences of this concept, both in life and in discourse. The relationship between components of a network are strengthened, and the actual dendritic tendrils and association of two neurons meeting at a synapse is strengthened by the frequency of association and co-occurring simultaneous activations. My first point that I want to make is that metaphors frequently occur in life, in counseling and the discussion of emotions, particularly in healing the wounds of trauma. I myself have gone through this class, and the most powerful part to me was literally writing our cares and describing our hurts, writing them on Post-it notes, nailing it to a physical cross. The metaphor of putting it on Christ and letting go of it is a very powerful healing tool. Metaphors frequently occur, and I posit comprise the most powerful worship songs. Metaphors frequently occur in scripture. Now, my methodology is looking at James 1. I chose it because it's short, so looking at the Greek to examine all the metaphors that appear. The results are that there are 16 obvious metaphors, for example, being the wave being driven by the wind. But there are many more, 49 not obvious metaphors. Even in the first two verses are slave, diaspora, brothers, count, test, and meet. Unfortunately, I don't have all the time to expand on these, but I just want to give you an idea of how common they are, so much that even if I don't count the repetitions, there are 1.7 different metaphors per verse. I'm going to dig into a few of these non-obvious metaphors, but as a side note, let me say that the high frequency of metaphors is not specific to James. One way to identify how frequent metaphors are is to identify where the first one appears. I've looked at just a handful, and the first one in each book of the first 5 books of the New Testament as well as 2 Old Testament books, arises in the first or second verse, mostly the first. I looked at Mark chapter 1, a very different kind of discourse genre from James, a narrative and one from a person who likes to keep up a quick pace of describing events. The average, not counting repetitions, per verse is 1.8 metaphors. Now, my second point I want to make is that metaphors are frequently overlooked. This may happen because of 4 reasons. The Greek carries a meaning that translation into the language of wider communication loses. This may actually occur with a second reason, that etymology, the history of a word, reveals a metaphor, but the meaning is not easily recognized because it has been fossilized, or as I like to say, it's become idiomatic. The meaning is so ingrained that people don't see the metaphor anymore. Don't worry, I'll present some examples soon. Another way that metaphors are overlooked are that translators are commonly advised to abandon the metaphor and replace it with an explanation. And finally, another way metaphors are overlooked is that their connection to other metaphors in scripture are cut off. This is one of my most data-heavy slides. So I've selected from the 49 non-obvious metaphors. In verse 1, diaspora. Diaspora actually includes the word spore, a word for seed. And James is talking to the diaspora, the Jewish people who have been scattered away from Jerusalem. Translations maintain the scattered part, but they neglect the part of the word that specifically refers to seeds being scattered. It's a precise word used in the domain of gardening, of farming. If you incorporate the meaning of a seed being dispersed, you then add the nuance of meaning that there's a seed being sent out and scattered for a purpose, because a seed, by definition, is meant for reduplication of the plant. What an encouragement that there is intent in people being scattered across the world. That it is not just random. In verse 3, 4, and 12, we find a form for steadfastness. Upomonen and upomenen are variations of the meaning stay or to dwell under. It was not easy to find this most literal and easily perceivable definition. This is the most simple and literal definition of upomonen. But there's other definitions in the same lexicons that say that this word means to continue to bear up under difficult circumstances. This phrasing seems to me to be very hard for a person with a high school education or a high school level of English to understand. It's also described as endurance, being able to endure. But at its most basic and simplest, the word means to stay under, to remain even under difficult, weighty circumstances, heavy and difficult circumstances. This idiomatic meaning is not readily recognized just because it's eclipsed by the Greek. And even this literal meaning is not a common definition in the lexicons. The lexicons tend to go more for the abstract meanings without addressing the simplest one. Verse 18 actually presents the second occurrence of apekuo, to give birth. Very rarely does an English translation preserve this repetition of the same verb that gives us actually some discourse structure of several sentences demonstrating a contrast. While desire gives birth to sin, God gives birth to new life, spiritual good, us as first fruits. Instead, the RSV, which typically is seen as a very direct translation, transposes this and says, instead of giving birth, God brought us forth. Not only does dismissing this metaphor of God giving birth to us lose that discourse structure, you also lose connections to other discourse even farther away. The idea of producing an important result is giving birth is an idea that is that correlates or corresponds also with other metaphors like working out results or producing fruit or effect results. It also loses our connection to other births, whether literal, like Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Esau and Jacob being born, to more metaphorical uses of birth, even more distant metaphor of end times coming after labor pains. I would even specify this metaphor as producing an important lives-changing result is giving birth. Consequences of cutting off these connections across metaphors, across the activation of senses, and across scriptures that link cultures and even languages, is that it limits opportunity to detect the nuance of metaphors, like diaspora, being scattered seed sent out. It limits the opportunity for activation of universal metaphors, like a seed, which is everywhere in the world. We don't have as memorable a scripture outcome. And we lose the opportunity to meditate on metaphors that God has placed throughout scripture. It reveals his good news to us. Metaphors are calculable. We are able to figure out the meaning. Some of the skills that have to be established and built upon starts with understanding the literal meaning and finding out that it's insufficient. It doesn't make sense if it's a metaphor. A person is able to activate semantic core features, say of a slave, the most core being that they have to submit their will to somebody. When James calls himself a slave of Jesus Christ, he's not literally one by legal definition, but he chooses to identify himself as one and take on that metaphor. To continue interpreting a metaphor, a novel metaphor, one encountered for the first time in scripture, you have to, of course, be able to find similarities between the easily perceivable thing and the less perceivable. An interpreter has the ability to hypothesize on what the author's intended theme of the text is to help them specify what are the features that are drawn upon. And using this, a good, engaged listener or reader of scripture can synthesize a new implicit understanding of the metaphor beyond what is explicitly stated. When you see a person's eyes flit right to left, back and forth, when they're encountering a new metaphor, it's because they're using their left side of the brain to detect what the meaning is presented, but figure out what the big picture is with their right side of the brain. It's impressively brief, the process of calculating a metaphor. Let me give you an example. Now I'm going to talk about cognitive linguistic data specifically with children in the age of 3 to 7 years old. Let me give you a metaphor that my daughter, when she was 4 years old, here at the SIL preschool, created. Which is harder, to create and produce a metaphor or to comprehend? So production, of course. So her production means that she already has a high level of understanding. Preschool finished. I took her to the bathroom. She sat there for a while I was outside waiting. And suddenly she's like, Mommy, my poop is like David. Okay, give you a second to think about that. It's a novel metaphor she created. How long does it take for you to consider some possible meanings? Do you maybe have an idea, maybe not, but I asked her to elaborate. She said, my poop is small like David. And I said, yes. What else do you mean? But it's so powerful. And so, of course, she was referring to the smell. So she created a metaphor by herself when she was 4 years old. Now, you may wonder if because she's a daughter of a linguist, she maybe has a little bit more advanced cognitive skills. But I want to bring to your attention another study, 5 to 7-year-olds. Without taking too much time to go into their test design, they determined that there is a steady improvement of metaphor identification skills, metaphor interpretation skills. But there was quite a range in each of the ages. 5-year-olds had quite a big range of ability, some only being able to understand some of it, some of the metaphors, and 7-year-olds also encompassing that same wide range. So even though there was improvement, there was quite a variability in terms of individuals' success. But what corresponds between these two pieces of data? My daughter's metaphor creation at 4 years old, and this study of the development of skills and the potential for accurate metaphor understanding up to 83% at 7 years old points to an age that might be quite surprising to you of accurate understanding of metaphors without any context. So I want to use this data to demonstrate to you how even the least educated among us, 7 years old means they maybe have 2 years of primary education, can calculate meaning from metaphors even when given minimal support. How much more then can the rural villager, adult around the world understand even if they don't have an education? And how much more with the support of discourse cues, perhaps when they read a text or listen to it, the theme or footnotes or an added phrase for context may help and guide somebody to an accurate understanding of metaphor. So my point is, of all the reasons you might want to avoid a metaphor, don't let it be because you underestimate what an uneducated villager can calculate. I've just given you a little bit of data, but along with this, I want to give you some translation strategies as well. Even before you meet specific scripture, why don't you take some time to do a rapid metaphor or idiom retrieval session, kind of analogous to rapid word retrieval times, where you think about what are some different phrases used to express controlling harmful speech. Before even talking about bridling the tongue, what are some ways that your culture talks about maybe loose lips or biting your tongue, and what exactly that means? And once you've done that semantic exploral, then later you can consider how this may correlate or correspond very accurately to metaphors that arise in the Bible. Before explaining a novel metaphor to maybe one of your MTTs, give the reader time to let their eyes spontaneously flit, go back and forth as they try to understand the details of the text and what big picture meaning it corresponds to, using discourse cues. Give them time. It might not be a skill that they've built up, but skill like apparent in the study of 5 to 7-year-olds that can be developed incrementally. Another suggestion is to establish conceptual equivalence, not just word equivalence, by identifying semantic features of a metaphor as abilities. For example, regarding the tongue, it's controllable. Even if somebody doesn't talk in their language about a bridle and a horse as control, what other instruments of control might there be? I can imagine perhaps a whip your tongue into shape. Anyways, I can't imagine what all the possibilities are. That's something that you can brainstorm as a team, as a translation team. Note that multiple non-connected meanings of metaphors can exist within a large text like the Bible. Something described as low can refer to sad emotions, but it can also refer to shame and dishonor to a person. Like loosening the straps of sandals is a shameful thing that John the Baptist was willing to do. There can be different meanings neighboring, and that's okay because language is wide and full of multitudes. Possible action points: maybe broaden the goal of your translation accuracy to include keeping connections across scripture and across languages and maintaining metaphors, not erasing them. On the other end, don't go overboard from translation into a paraphrase, adding metaphors that carry incorrect meaning. You could also do your own research. Find metaphors in the Greek, English, and your own target language. Inquire of the children in your sphere of influence to see what their capacity in metaphor comprehension is. You might be surprised at their high ability. You could also share paratext flags of various metaphors with me. Here are some specific resources I referred to, specifically the one about 5 to 7-year-olds is the second one by Nippold and Sullivan. In my abstract, I promised to interact with McElhennon and Christy Hemphill's work. I plan to do that in my live presentation, but here are some of their resources. Blessings to you as you maybe stoop and see investigating more into connected metaphors in scripture.